There was a time when America ate at places called Lum's, Red Barn, and Gino's, chains that once had hundreds of locations coast to coast and are now completely gone, wiped off the map so thoroughly that most people under 40 have never even heard the names. Some vanished overnight in a single bankruptcy filing, others just quietly faded, one closed location at a time, until nobody noticed the last one had gone too. So today, we're counting down 15 restaurant chains that completely vanished from America. Number 15, Naugles. Dick Naugle opened the first Naugles in Riverside, California in 1970, a Southern California Mexican-American fast food joint built around items like the taco burger and a distinctive red and green sauce combination. It grew to more than 200 locations across several states, becoming a genuine rival to the very chain its founder had helped start years earlier, Del Taco. That connection came back to bite Naugles eventually. The two chains merged in 1988, and within a handful of years, nearly every Naugles location had either been converted into a Del Taco or simply closed. The very last standalone Naugles in Carson City, Nevada, shut its doors in 1995. The story doesn't end there, though. A food blogger named Christian Zebarth spent years fighting Del Taco in trademark court, successfully proving in 2015 that Del Taco had abandoned the Naugles name and reopened the first revival location in Fountain Valley, California, that same year, complete with recreated original recipes. What makes the Naugles case genuinely unusual is the legal mechanism behind its comeback. Under U.S. trademark law, a brand name that sits completely unused for long enough can be legally declared abandoned, opening the door for someone else to claim it. Zebarth's petition to the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board argued exactly that. Del Taco had bought Naugles, quietly let the name die, and then simply sat on the trademark for 2 decades without using it. The board agreed, and Zebarth spent the better part of a decade working with chef John Smittle to painstakingly recreate menu items like the bun taco and the Naugle burger from scratch, based purely on memory and fan-shared recipes, since Del Taco never handed over the original documentation. Number 14, Red Barn. Founded in Springfield, Ohio in 1961, Red Barn built its restaurants to look exactly like their name suggested, bright red barn-shaped buildings with white trim, silos, and weather vanes. It pioneered the self-service salad bar years before most competitors caught on, and its Big Barney burger actually beat McDonald's Big Mac to market by a couple of years. At its peak, Red Barn operated between 300 and 400 locations across 19 states, plus outposts in Canada and Australia. The chain was acquired by United Fruit Company in 1967 and later folded into City Investing Company in 1978, a conglomerate primarily interested in real estate and financial services rather than actually running restaurants. City Investing simply let the franchise leases expire and stopped advertising entirely. By 1983, only about 100 Red Barns remained, and the chain filed for bankruptcy in 1986 with just 22 locations left. The final leases expired around 1988, and some buildings limped on briefly under the name The Farm before disappearing entirely. Red Barn's mascots, a trio of cartoon characters called simply the Hungries, Hamburger Hungry, Chicken Hungry, and Big Fish Hungry, became genuinely beloved among kids who grew up watching Saturday morning commercials in the 1970s. Longtime fans have kept the brand's memory alive online decades after the last location closed, with a Facebook group titled, "I Remember the Red Barn Restaurants," attracting more than 9,000 members. Unlike several other chains on this list, Red Barn has never seen a serious commercial revival attempt, leaving it as one of the more purely nostalgic entries here, a beloved brand that exists today only in old photographs, faded jingles, and the memories of the people who grew up eating Big Barneys under its distinctive red roof. Number 13, Gino's Hamburgers. Gino's traces its roots to 1957, when Baltimore Colts players Alan Ameche and Joe Campanella, along with their friend Louis Fisher, opened a burger stand in Dundalk, Maryland. Colts defensive end Gino Marchetti joined as an investor in 1959, and the chain took his name. Gino's grew into a genuine East Coast institution, serving up burgers like the Gino Giant and holding the exclusive Mid-Atlantic franchise rights for Kentucky Fried Chicken. By 1982, Gino's had grown to 359 company-owned locations before Marriott Corporation acquired the entire chain and promptly discontinued the brand, converting most locations into outposts of Marriott's other fast food chain, Roy Rogers. The very last independently owned Gino's in Pasadena, Maryland, closed in 1986. The name got a small second life in 2010 when some of the original principals launched Gino's Burgers and Chicken in Maryland and Pennsylvania, though it never approached the scale of the original chain. There's a genuinely strange bit of business history buried in the Gino's story, too. The chain also acquired and operated the Rustler Steakhouse chain starting in 1971, a concept originally founded by co-founder Joe Campanella after he'd already left Gino's to strike out on his own. Marriott, upon acquiring Gino's in 1982, had no particular interest in keeping the steakhouse side of the business and sold Rustler off separately within months, passing it through 2 more owners before it was folded into Collins Foods in 1985. It's a small footnote, but a telling one. Even the pieces of Gino's that outlived the original burger chain didn't manage to survive under their own name for very long either. Number 12. Rax Roast Beef. Jack Roshman opened the first location, originally called Jack's Roast Beef, in Springfield, Ohio, in 1967, selling it to General Foods 2 years later. After a round of closures in 1972, new ownership rebranded the surviving locations as Rax, and by the mid-1980s the chain had grown to a genuine peak of 504 locations across 38 states and, somewhat inexplicably, Guatemala. Then came Mr. Delicious, a bespectacled, sport coat-wearing cartoon mascot introduced in 1992, who delivered deadpan monologues about his midlife crisis and marital troubles between bites of roast beef sandwiches. It's the kind of ad campaign that, decades later, internet commentators love to praise as ahead of its time. At the time, it did nothing to stop the bleeding. Rax filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just 3 months after the campaign launched. The chain limped through multiple additional bankruptcies and a failed conversion deal with Hardee's through the 1990s, shrinking from over 500 locations down to just a handful of independently run restaurants clustered in Ohio, Kentucky, and Illinois today. The deeper problem behind Rax's collapse, according to most retrospectives on the chain, wasn't really Mr. Delicious at all. It was years of directionless menu changes that came before him. Rax tried repositioning itself as an upscale, fast food with style concept, added and removed items constantly, and never settled on a clear identity distinct from its much larger rival Arby's, which was serving the exact same core roast beef sandwich with far more consistency. By the time the company attempted one more rebrand in the mid-1990s, complete with a new logo and simplified menu, Wendy's had already swooped in to purchase 37 of the remaining locations, specifically to convert them into Tim Hortons outlets, closing the door on any real chance of a broader comeback. Number 11. Beefsteak Charlie's. The Beefsteak Charlie's name actually dates back to 1910, when Charles Chesser opened a Manhattan restaurant that became known for serving free beer with every 2 dishes ordered. Restaurateur Larry Ellman revived the unprotected name in 1976, rebranding his existing steak and brew locations, and built it into a chain famous for an all-you-can-eat salad and shrimp bar paired with genuinely unlimited beer, wine, or sangria under slogans like, "I'll feed you like there's no tomorrow." The math behind giving away that much food and drink eventually caught up with the company. By 1984, Beefsteak Charlie's had grown to roughly 68 locations, but a 1987 acquisition by Bombay Palace Restaurants for $8.4 million in stock accelerated the decline rather than reversing it. Bombay itself filed for bankruptcy just 2 years later, leaving only 35 locations standing. The chain limped on in scattered form for another decade, with the final 2 original New York locations closing by 2001, one partly a casualty of the September 11th attacks that same year. It's worth pointing out just how unusual the original Beefsteak Charlie's pricing model actually was for its era. Steak dinner deals ran as low as $8.99 as recently as 1983, a price that already included the unlimited salad bar and free-flowing drinks, a combination that would be almost unthinkable at a full-service restaurant today. That aggressive value proposition is exactly what built the chain's loyal following in the first place, and exactly what made the underlying economics so fragile once competition intensified and the cost of feeding customers essentially without limit kept climbing every year. A trademark re-registration in 2001 briefly tried to resurrect the concept for a new generation, but none of the locations that opened under that revived registration lasted more than a few years before disappearing as well. Number 10. Lums. Brothers Stewart and Clifford Perlman purchased a small 16-seat hot dog stand in Miami Beach for $10,000 in 1956 and built it into Lums, a chain famous almost entirely for one gimmick: hot dogs steamed in beer. It grew to more than 400 locations across the United States, Puerto Rico, and Europe by 1972. And the Perlmans got rich enough along the way to buy Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas for $60 million in 1969. 2 years after that Vegas purchase, the brothers sold Lums restaurant operations to John Y. Brown, then chairman of Kentucky Fried Chicken, who paid $1 million just for the recipe to a new item called the Ollie Burger and hired Milton Berle as the chain's TV spokesman. None of it stuck. Locations shrank from 400 to 273 by 1978, when Brown sold what remained to a Swiss company called Wienerwald, which filed for bankruptcy just 4 years later in 1982. A scattering of independently owned Lums survived for decades after the corporate collapse, with the very last one, in Bellevue, Nebraska, finally closing in 2017 after 49 years in business. Clifford Perlman's own post-Lums career arguably overshadowed the restaurant chain that made his fortune in the first place. As chairman of Caesar's World, the company that grew out of his Caesar's Palace purchase, Perlman helped transform Las Vegas into a legitimate hub for major boxing and tennis events, and he personally brought Frank Sinatra in for a headlining residency that lasted the better part of a decade. It's a strange footnote to Lum's own story. A hot dog chain built on a novelty gimmick ended up indirectly bankrolling some of the biggest entertainment moments in Las Vegas history, long after most Americans had forgotten where the money that built Caesar's Palace originally came from. Number 9. Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor. Bob Farrell and Ken McCarthy opened the first Farrell's in Portland, Oregon in 1963, built around an early 1900s theme complete with staff in period dress, straw boater hats, and a player piano. It became the go-to destination for children's birthday parties nationwide, famous for over-the-top group desserts like the zoo, an enormous sundae carried out on a stretcher with sirens blaring, and the pig's trough, served with a drum roll and an announcement congratulating anyone who managed to finish it solo. Marriott Corporation bought the chain in 1972, growing it to a peak of 130 locations by 1975, before selling it off to private investors in 1982 amid declining sales and increasingly inconsistent management. By 1990, nearly every Farrell's location had closed. A handful of dedicated revival attempts followed over the following decades, including a 2016 investment from CNBC's The Profit star Marcus Lemonis. But the very last Farrell's, in Brea, California, finally shut its doors for good in 2019. Number 8. Sambo's. Sam Battistone and Newell Bonnet opened the first Sambo's in Santa Barbara, California in 1957, and the name itself was originally just a combination of their nicknames, Sam and Bo. The chain grew explosively through the 1960s and 70s, eventually reaching 1,117 locations across 47 states. But it leaned hard into imagery drawn from the racially charged 1899 children's book, The Story of Little Black Sambo, decorating restaurants with murals and characters inspired directly by the book. As the chain expanded into the Northeast in the late 1970s, that branding drew increasingly organized protests and lawsuits, and some locations were rebranded as the Jolly Tiger in response, before the company controversially reversed course and restored the original name in 1979. Combined with genuine financial mismanagement, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November of 1981, closing 450 restaurants that year alone. By 1984, the chain had been sold off entirely, with most locations rebranded under names like Seasons Friendly Eating or sold directly to competitors, including Denny's. one single location in Santa Barbara continued operating under the original name for nearly 4 more decades, finally changing its name in 2020 amid the nationwide protests following George Floyd's murder. Company executives spent years insisting the name carried no racial intent at all, pointing to its origin as a simple combination of the founders' own nicknames. That defense grew harder to sustain the longer the chain leaned into imagery lifted straight from the controversial source material. Anyway, decorating dining rooms with murals and mascots drawn directly from the book rather than distancing itself from the association once it became clear how the name was actually being received. By the time the company itself acknowledged the problem publicly, financial collapse had already made the question largely moot. Number 7. Minnie Pearl's Chicken System. Nashville attorney John J. Hooker Jr. approached Grand Ole Opry comedian Minnie Pearl in 1967 with an idea: put her name and her catchphrase, "How delicious," on a new fried chicken chain built to compete directly with Kentucky Fried Chicken. The Hooker brothers sold franchise rights aggressively, and by 1968, the company had sold roughly 1,200 franchises, even though barely more than 100 restaurants were actually open and operating. The real problem was how the company reported its earnings. Minnie Pearl's Chicken System counted unsold franchise fees as current profit, sending its stock price soaring even as the underlying restaurants lost money at an alarming rate, an estimated $31 million in 1969 alone. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigated. The stock collapsed from over $50 a share down to roughly 44 cents, and by the early 1970s, the company, by then renamed Performance Systems Inc., had abandoned the restaurant business entirely. All roughly 300 locations closed or went bankrupt, taking down a sister chicken chain fronted by singer Mahalia Jackson in the process. Number 6. Bennigan's. Norman Brinker, one of the most influential figures in American casual dining, created Bennigan's, an Irish pub-themed restaurant chain, while working as an executive at Pillsbury's restaurant division in the 1970s. It grew alongside Brinker's earlier creation, Steak and Ale, eventually reaching more than 200 corporate-owned and franchised locations across the country, known for a lively bar atmosphere and menu items like the Monte Cristo sandwich. Both chains ended up under the same ownership umbrella, S&A Restaurant Corp., and both collapsed on the exact same day. On July 29, 2008, the parent company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, closing all 150 corporate-owned Bennigan's locations without warning, though a number of independently owned franchise locations survived and continue operating today. In 2015, former executives Paul and Gwen Mangiameli purchased the intellectual property for both Bennigan's and Steak and Ale, forming legendary restaurant brands to slowly revive both names. Number 5. Steak and Ale. Norman Brinker opened the first Steak and Ale in Dallas on February 26, 1966, built around a genuinely novel idea at the time: quality steak dinners in an intimate English Inn-styled setting at prices ordinary families could actually afford. The chain is widely credited with pioneering the modern casual dining format, and it introduced the all-you-can-eat salad bar to a mainstream American audience, growing to nearly 300 locations by the 1980s. Steak and Ale and Bennigan's were eventually consolidated under the same corporate parent, and when that company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on July 29, 2008, all 58 remaining corporate-owned Steak and Ale locations closed permanently, with no advance warning to employees or regular customers. A dedicated Facebook group called Steak and Ale's Comeback grew to nearly 55,000 followers over the following years, and that grassroots nostalgia eventually helped convince the Mangiameles to relaunch the brand, opening the first new Steak and Ale location in 16 years in Burnsville, Minnesota, in July of 2024. Number 4. Kenny Rogers Roasters. Country music legend Kenny Rogers teamed up with former Kentucky governor and ex-KFC chairman John Y. Brown Jr. in 1991 to launch a wood-fired rotisserie chicken chain positioned as a healthier alternative to fried chicken. It expanded explosively, reaching more than 350 locations across the US and Canada within just a few years, and its cultural footprint peaked in 1996 when an entire episode of Seinfeld, The Chicken Roaster, was built around Kramer's obsession with a Kenny Rogers Roasters that opened across from his apartment. Stiff competition from Boston Market and KFC's own rotisserie line proved too much, though, and the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1998. Nathan's Famous, the hot dog company, bought the brand for just $1.25 million the following year, but American locations kept dwindling regardless. The very last Kenny Rogers Roasters in the United States, tucked into a California mall food court, closed on December 31, 2011. The brand survives today almost entirely in Asia, run by Malaysian conglomerate Berjaya Corporation, with more than 100 locations across Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Middle East. The Seinfeld connection turned out to be worth more to the brand's cultural memory than any actual marketing budget could have bought. A company spokesperson told the South Florida Sun-Sentinel in 1996 that airtime on a show as popular as Seinfeld would have cost roughly $1 million a minute to buy outright, and the episode delivered that exposure entirely free. Employees reportedly threw a company-wide celebration the night the episode aired. It's a strange kind of immortality. The actual restaurant chain vanished from American strip malls more than a decade ago, but thanks to reruns and streaming, new viewers discover Kenny Rogers Roasters through Kramer's obsession with it every single day, long after most of them could ever have actually eaten there. Number 3. Burger Chef. Brothers Frank and Donald Thomas opened the first Burger Chef in Indianapolis in 1954, and the chain grew explosively enough that by 1971, it had more than 1,200 locations, trailing only McDonald's nationally. Burger Chef genuinely innovated too, introducing the Fun Meal in 1973, widely considered the first kids' meal to combine a burger, fries, a drink, and a small toy, years before McDonald's Happy Meal arrived. And, according to a lawsuit Burger Chef actually filed and lost, borrowed the concept. A genuine tragedy also shadows the chain's history. In late 1978, 4 young Burger Chef employees were kidnapped and murdered in Indiana, a case that made national headlines and cast a dark shadow over the brand during an already difficult stretch. General Foods, which had owned Burger Chef since 1968, sold the struggling chain to Amasco, owner of Hardee's, in 1982. Most locations were converted to Hardee's or simply closed over the following years. The very last Burger Chef, in Cookeville, Tennessee, closed in 1996 when its franchise agreement finally expired. Hardee's has, at least, kept a small ember of the brand alive over the decades since. The company brought back Burger Chef's signature Big Chef sandwich as a limited-time promotional item on 3 separate occasions in 2001, 2007, and 2014, each time drawing a genuinely enthusiastic response from longtime fans who remembered the original. A handful of former locations in Cleveland, Tennessee, South Charleston, West Virginia, and Reidsville, North Carolina, still quietly sell versions of the old Burger Chef menu today under different names entirely, operating completely independent of any corporate ownership, run by families who simply never stopped making the same food their customers had always come back for. Number 2. Chi-Chi's. Norm McDermott and former Green Bay Packers player Max McGee founded Chi-Chi's in 1975, introducing Tex-Mex cuisine to a Midwest audience that had barely encountered it before. The chain grew to more than 200 locations at its peak in 1986, becoming a genuine category leader in casual Mexican dining across the country. Chi-Chi's downfall came in 2 brutal, back-to-back blows. The company, by then reduced to 144 locations and owned by Prandium Inc., filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 8, 2003. 1 month later, a Chi-Chi's location near Pittsburgh became the source of the largest hepatitis A outbreak in American history, with more than 650 confirmed illnesses and 4 deaths traced back to contaminated green onions. Lawsuits from the outbreak totaled more than $40 million. Chi-Chi's sold its remaining U.S. assets to Outback Steakhouse in 2004 and closed every American location for good. Remarkably, the son of one of the original founders announced plans to revive the American brand in December of 2024 in partnership with Hormel Foods, which had owned the Chi-Chi's name on grocery store salsa and packaged goods for decades. Investigators eventually traced the contamination back to green onions grown or processed on farms in Mexico, a discovery that prompted the FDA to issue an outright import ban on scallions from 4 specific farms and pushed the CDC to recommend, for the first time, that all American children received the hepatitis A vaccine starting in 2006. The outbreak's legacy extended well beyond the one chain it destroyed, effectively reshaping national food safety policy around fresh produce traceability for the following 2 decades. Chi-Chi's own European operations, entirely separate from the American bankruptcy, actually survived the longest of all, with a single remaining location in Vienna, Austria, finally closing in 2022, nearly 2 decades after the last U.S. restaurant shut its doors. Number 1. Howard Johnson's. Topping this list is the chain that was, for decades, quite simply, the largest restaurant company in the United States. Howard Johnson opened his first ice cream stand near Boston in 1925 and built it into an empire of orange-roofed roadside restaurants serving fried clam strips, hot dogs, and 28 flavors of ice cream. By the 1960s and 70s, Howard Johnson's had grown to roughly 1,000 locations coast to coast, and the company reportedly served more meals outside the home during that decade than any organization in America besides the U.S. Army itself. The rise of interstate-adjacent fast food chains like McDonald's, which prioritized speed and consistency over Howard Johnson's sit-down, full-service format, began eating away at the brand through the 1970s and 80s. Marriott bought the struggling company in 1985, splitting the hotel business from the restaurants and selling most of the actual dining locations off entirely. Decades of shrinking followed, with the count falling to just a handful of holdout restaurants by the 2000s. One in Lake Placid, New York, which closed in 2015, one in Bangor, Maine, which closed in 2016 after 50 years, and finally, the very last Howard Johnson's restaurant on the planet in Lake George, New York, which quietly closed its doors in 2022, ending a run that had spanned nearly a century. One Howard Johnson's fan captured the mood of that final closure perfectly in a Facebook post that circulated widely at the time, describing cobwebs collecting on the door just before what should have been the Memorial Day rush and writing simply, "Lake George is officially dead." The chain's cultural footprint lingers in strange, scattered ways even now. The Mad Men production team recreated a Howard Johnson set for a memorable scene, a fitting choice given how thoroughly the orange-roofed restaurants once defined the exact stretch of mid-century American road trip culture that show spent years recreating. And while the restaurant chain is entirely gone, the Howard Johnson's hotel brand, sold off separately decades ago, survives today under Wyndham ownership with roughly 300 locations still operating across the country. Why they all disappeared? Look across all 15 of these vanished chains, and the reasons repeat with remarkable consistency. Corporate acquisitions gone wrong sank Burger Chef, Gino's, and Red Barn alike, each one bought by a larger company that either mismanaged it or simply had no real interest in running restaurants in the first place. Genuine crisis, a hepatitis outbreak, an SEC fraud investigation, a racially charged brand identity nobody was willing to defend forever, finished off Chi-Chi's, Minnie Pearls, and Sambo's. And in nearly every case covered tonight, a single catastrophic bankruptcy filing, often triggered by debt piled on during years of aggressive overexpansion, turned a beloved regional or national institution into a punchline almost overnight. There's also a pattern worth noting in exactly when most of these chains actually collapsed. A genuine cluster of them, Red Barn, Beefsteak Charlie's, Lums, Sambo's, Farrell's, all hit their breaking point sometime between the late 1970s and the early 1990s, a stretch that coincided almost exactly with the explosive national growth of standardized fast food giants like McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's. Regional chains built around a single gimmick, beer-steamed hot dogs, unlimited salad bars, novelty mascots, simply couldn't match the operational consistency and marketing budgets those national players brought to every single market they entered. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in American business history. A genuinely clever idea can build a regional empire, but sustaining that empire against a wave of better-funded, more disciplined competitors is an entirely different and considerably harder problem. What's genuinely striking, looking back across this entire list, is how many of these names have found some kind of second life anyway. Naugles, Steak and Ale, Chi-Chi's, and Gino's have all been revived in some form by nostalgic entrepreneurs willing to bet that the loyalty never actually disappeared, only the restaurants themselves did. If you enjoyed this trip back through America's forgotten restaurant graveyard, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the chains that used to define American dining and the surprising reasons they all disappeared.